Welcome to PM in the PM. This is the weekly Monday afternoon podcast where I look at a recent event or news item and look at how it can link with the ACCA Performance Management Syllabus. The benefit of listening to these is we're giving real-world application of what you'll be learning in the PM syllabus. It means you're more likely to remember it. Hopefully you'll give better answers to the application questions. But as I always say, it won't just help with PM. If you go on to do APM, it will help with that too. So what are we talking about today? Well, I happen to be on an annual family holiday in the lovely county of Cornwall. And we stay on this lovely estate called Trellewarren. It's on the Lizard Peninsula. This is our 14th year of coming, and we just love it as a family. And one of the highlights of coming to Cornwall, and there are many, is the Cornish pasty, a delicacy of Cornwall. It's one of those items of food where there's lots of competition. If you ever come to Cornwall, you'll see some claim they've got the best Cornish pasties. Some say they've been doing them for the longest period of time. There's even places that do the biggest ones. So it's one of those food that the County of Cornwall really embraces as its own. It's a thick pastry that's stuffed with potato, swede, onion and beef, and it's seasoned with salt and pepper. The earliest appearance of the Cornish pasty in English literature is back in the 1300s. That's 725 years ago when King Edward III was on the throne. But I think the Cornish pasty really grew in the 1800s. Tin mining was a big industry back then in Cornwall, and the Cornish pasty was lunch. It was a really good way to package all those nutrients up for the tin miners to take down and have at lunchtime. The thick crust pastry meant that it was robust, so it really grew in popularity back in the 1800s. In 1993, it began to benefit from geographic protection, which prevents anyone outside of Cornwall making a pasty and call it a Cornish pasty. So why am I telling you all about Cornish pasties? Well, within the Cornish pasty, as I said, there's a mix of ingredients, and this ties very nicely into syllabus area D, mix and yield variances. And I'm sorry, I know this is probably everyone's worst part of the syllabus. We're not going to look at calculations because it's not really going to work on a podcast, but a number of the questions in the exam are narrative only. And I really want to emphasize, just because you see a variance question, if you struggle with variances, that doesn't mean you can't do it, because the narrative bit I think you should be able to get, and hopefully this will help you. Examples of questions that use mix and yield variances, they're normally about making a juice or a milkshake or a smoothie or a pie, or in this case a Cornish pasty, and other non-food items like paints, where there's a mix of materials and an ability to change the amounts of each of those in control of the manager. There's some key things in variances that I often think it's worth emphasizing. Whenever we look at a variance, we are trying to deal with it in isolation. We try and neutralize the effect of all other variances and just report on that one variance. And then we do it for a different variance and a different one. Otherwise, you can't compare like with like. And I think that's why the calculations get tricky, because the calculations aim to neutralize the effect of all other variances. So you then just focus on the variance on which you're reporting. And then you move on and do another variance. And by doing that, you neutralize the effect of all other variances. That's really important. Another key mistake that's made again and again, and it might sound obvious, but variances are measured in monetary terms. So in the ACC exam, they'll be in dollars. They're not measured in kilograms. They're not measured in hours. If you report a variance and it's not measured in dollars, you have missed at least one stage out. You need to convert it from hours into dollars, or you need to convert it from kilograms into dollars, normally by multiplying it by something else, i.e. the labor rate. Make sure you keep track of what units you're working in, because it's an easy mark to get if you just take that one extra step. And I often see students haven't taken that last step, and it's a real shame because that one mark can really make a difference. So let's start looking at materials variances. The materials variance is where we spend a different amount on materials compared to what we expected to spend based on the flexed budget. So we flex the budget to reflect the actual output, and then we compare what we thought we should spend compared to what we did spend. And that can lead to a price variance. And because we're talking about materials, it could be a favourable or an adverse materials price variance, where we spent more or less on the materials than we expected. Or it could be based on the amount of materials, so an adverse or favourable material usage variance. We use more materials or fewer materials than we thought. And as we're talking about Cornish pasty, by materials, we mean ingredients. On some occasions, we can split the materials usage variance further, and that's where mix and yield variances come in. We can only do this if there's a mix of materials. If it's just one material, one ingredient, we can't do this. If there's multiple materials and we can change the ratio that we use and still end up with the end product, then we can look at a further division of that materials usage variance. We would only do this if the manager can control that mix. If it's automated through a machine, then there becomes no point in doing it. So it has to be something that can be changed by management, because by changing it, they're going to lead to some variances. So let's look at mix variances first. So mix is where we use a different proportion of materials or ingredients than the standard. And we get a variance because some of those materials will be more expensive than others. So if we use more of a more expensive material and less of a less expensive material compared to our standard, then we end up with an adverse variance. If we flip that around, obviously if we use less of a more expensive material and more of a cheaper material, we end up with a favourable variance. Let's go back to my Cornish pasty. The cost per kilogram of meat is likely to be higher than the cost per kilogram of potato. So the person making it could increase the amount of potato, decrease the amount of meat, still produce a Cornish pasty and make a favourable mix variance because they're using more of that cheaper ingredient and less of that expensive ingredient. So then the obvious question is, well, why don't they do that? And the thing is, a mix variance will almost always have a knock-on effect elsewhere. And I want you to think in terms of quality. We'll look at that first, and then a bit later we'll look at yield. So let's say I had bought this pasta, and let's say they'd put so much potato in there was no room for meat. Well, I might be a bit unhappy because I've actually bought a pasty expecting meat in it. So it affects the quality. Although there's a financial benefit of using a cheaper material or ingredient, the quality is almost always affected. And this is where the narrative part of these variances comes into play in the exam. Make sure you think about the quality. If the quality of this pasty was dropped because of that mix change, either people won't buy it, so then we end up with an adverse sales volume variance, or they're going to have to charge a lower price, so they get an adverse sales price variance. If a competitor thought, well, actually, I can put more of the more expensive materials in, have higher quality product, then they could achieve favourable sales price or favourable sales volume variances. But they'd also have an adverse materials mix variance. The other part that comes into play are yield variances, and I think the quality thing's relatively easy to understand. I think yield is a bit harder to get your head around. And the way I would like to talk about it is there's always waste. Whenever we use a material in producing an end product, we expect some's going to be wasted. So let's stick with the Cornish pasty. The potato is peeled, so the peel from the potato is chucked away. The onion is peeled. The skin from the onion is chucked away. When they put the meat in, there's probably bits of meat which are a bit grizzly, a bit hard to chew, and they cut those out, chuck those away. So with each ingredient or each material, there's going to be some waste. With potatoes, maybe 100 kilograms of potatoes, 10%, maybe 10 kilograms turns into peel and is chucked away. Whereas with an onion with a much thinner skin, maybe it's 3 to 5%. So for example, if they use more onion and less potato, they're going to have a higher yield because there's less waste. It would use more of a material, the onion, that produces less waste, and less of the material, the potato, that produces more waste. So then they would get a favourable yield variance. They'd need fewer ingredients overall in order to produce the same amount of pasties. Likewise, it flips around. If they use more of a material that produces more waste, then that leads to an adverse yield variance. Although I think yield variances are a bit harder to understand, and hopefully that thinking about waste is going to help, there's normally a simpler way to calculate yield variances, whereas I think the mixed variances tend to be a bit harder, and that's the one more people struggle on. But just to re-emphasize, even if you do struggle on the calculations, I hope you can understand it, because even if you couldn't do any of the calculation parts in the exam, I want you to be able to nail those narrative parts, because those are the easy marks. So don't be put off by the question. Often they're quite wordy. If it's multiple choice, look at the answers that they give you to choose from. If they're not calculations, it's probably a narrative type question. I want you to think back to this podcast and the one I did last week, where we're talking about mix and yield variances this week. We're talking about planning and operational variances last week. And make sure you're getting those narrative marks Ideally, you would get the calculation ones, but I know that's an area that students really struggle with. I focused on materials here, but mix and yield variances also can be used when we're talking about labour. A labour mix variance would be if you have a team where there's different rates of pay depending on the people in the team. If you use a higher paid person doing more of the work and a lower paid person doing less of the work, that would be an adverse labour mix variance. And again, if we use more of the lower salaried person and less of the higher salaried person, then we end up with a favourable variance. But once again, think quality. Are we going to get a lower quality of output if we're using someone that's paid less? The labour yield variances, again, we might get better productivity from that higher paid person. So we could pay more for the outcome, but they might produce more. So we might have an adverse rate variance, whereas we also then get a favourable productivity variance. You see how they work together. Sales is also an area where mix comes into play. If you sell a mix of items and compare to your standard, what you expect to sell, if you end up selling more of the more expensive ones, you can end up with a favourable sales mix variance. A sales yield variance is where we're selling a different number of items overall. So if we normally sell 50 items in our mix, if we only sell 45, then we've got a volume variance. But if in the 50, if we normally sell 10 of each, but on this occasion we sold 15 of one, 5 of the other, and 10 of the others, then there's a mix variance there. So what we've done today is look at Cornish pasty, which is a delicious way to think of mix and yield variances. A really important thing is with the sales quantity variance, that isn't flexed. We don't flex the budget because we're comparing the volume or the quantity against the standard, so the actual against the standard. We don't flex that budget. All of the others we would flex. So make sure you're careful to flex. It's an easy mistake to make to forget to flex first. You've got to compare like with like. So thanks for tuning in to PM in the PM. Hope you found this episode informative. I'd love to receive your feedback and comments. And as always, please share this with anyone who you think is going to sit PM or is sitting PM. Hopefully they'll find it useful too. Until next time, this is Richard Guyver signing off.